Students taking Western Humanities often find themselves in a peculiar position on the first day of class, because unlike in other courses, they're not always sure what exactly it is they've signed up to study. Registering for Western Humanities is not like signing up for a course in biology or calculus or even literature. A student registering for biology knows he's going to study the structures of organic life. A student registering for calculus knows she's going to be learning about mathematical formulas. Even a literature student knows he'll be studying poems and novels and essays. Typically, students sign up for these courses because they're interested in them, they know something about them, or because it's part of their major. But students registering for Western Humanities often do so simply because their advisor told them they need to take a course to fulfill a general education requirement. They often have no idea what the course is about. They don't know what's meant by Western, and they don't know what's meant by humanities. So we're going to spend some time today discussing just what these things are. Some of you might be familiar with the term humanities from college catalogs. A lot of universities divide courses of study into large categories, such as humanities, math and sciences, social sciences, and what I'm calling the vocations, which are things like nursing, business administration, paralegal studies. But what do all these groupings mean, and in particular, what sorts of courses fall under the category of the humanities and why? Here are some courses of studies that are typically found under the category of the humanities and ones that are not. Take a moment and think about what differentiates the subjects on the left from the ones on the right. Now let's stop a moment and think about how we define terms, because that's what we're trying to do here. Define the terms Western and humanities. Socrates, one of the great philosophers of the Western humanities tradition, talks about defining terms in the Platonic dialogue Euthyphro. There he asks a priest named Euthyphro to define the word holiness. And at first Euthyphro offers examples of actions that are holy. But Socrates points out that offering examples is not a good way of defining a term because it doesn't get at its essence. Think about it for a minute. If I'm trying to define the word automobile to someone who's never seen one, I can say, well, a BMW is an automobile, or a Lexus, or a Subaru. But does that really help that person? Even if he knew how to recognize a Lexus or a Subaru, how would he know whether, say, a Prius is a car, unless I listed every single car that's on the road? And even that wouldn't help, because what would happen next year when a new model came out? Socrates believed you had to define the essential qualities of a term in order to define it properly, so that we could measure any new phenomena against those essential qualities. Thus, for example, we might define an automobile as a four-wheeled vehicle driven by an internal combustion engine. That would help us not only recognize a car, but distinguish it from a bicycle or motorcycle, though maybe not from a truck, so it's not a perfect definition. But what is the essence of the humanities? What do all those things, art, literature, poetry, drama, history, religion, philosophy, what do they all have in common? Now, different scholars might offer different answers, but here are a few of the ways that I've approached the question of how to come at the essence of the humanities. So, for example, the humanities are expressions of the human imagination. Things like poetry and painting and sculpture that emphasize vision and creativity and invention. They are disciplines in which man is at the center, both as the actor and as the subject of the discipline. Very often philosophy and history and religion. They are disciplines that depend on subjective experience. They are difficult to measure. They aren't subject to the rules of experimentation and scientific method, which is to say, you can experiment in music, but you don't subject musical experiments to the same kind of rigorous standards that you would subject testing on DNA samples. It's completely different idea of what it means to experiment, because music is largely subjective, not objective. But the thing I think that's most unique about the humanities is that they ask questions that the other disciplines don't ask. For me, what's most unique and special about the humanities, how they differ, say, from biology or political science, is that they ask questions the other disciplines not only don't ask, but for the most part can't ask. Biology can explain how we breathe, but not why we exist. Political science can categorize different expressions of human power, but can't tell us how that power ought to be exercised, what, for example, justice is. Geometry can tell us about symmetry, but not answer the question of what is beautiful. These questions of why and for what purpose, these questions that address essentially the meaning of life, are unique to the humanities. They are considered off limits to the other disciplines, but not to these ones, which is why the humanities are so important and fascinating. So fine, we have some idea about what the humanities are, but what do we mean by Western? You see, even a term as simple as Western is not crystal clear. I mean, in some contexts, Western would mean cowboys. Like if you put Western in front of movies, it means it's a cowboy movie. So what do we mean when we put Western in front of humanities? Well, it's not simple. There's probably several ways we can look at it. A direction, west as opposed to east, a geography, tradition, state of mind. Let's explore these. So, often the humanities are associated with the ancient world, because this is where we saw a great flowering of art, philosophy, music, drama, literature, history. And when I say the ancient world, specifically I mean ancient Greece and Rome. In that sense, it's a geographic designation as well as directional, distinguishing the Western ancient world from the Eastern ancient world, from China and India and Japan, Arabia. But it's not so much the places that matter, or it's not just the places that matter, as the traditions that emerged from these two civilizations. Traditions in architecture, sculpture, philosophy, music, painting. The Eastern world also, for example, has architecture, but we call architecture Western when it resembles or has evolved from the styles of architecture that originated in Greece and Rome and the other countries in the Western tradition. So that, for example, if you built a Colosseum like the one on the right in Beijing or in Nepal, it wouldn't matter that they are in perhaps an Eastern Hemisphere. They are examples of Western architecture. A more modern approach to the humanities often traces its origins to a geography and tradition that includes all of Western Europe and is especially concerned with the renewed interest in art and philosophy that emerged at the end of the Middle Ages with the Renaissance and continued on through the Reformation and the period known as the Enlightenment to our own time. We might call this the modern tradition in the Western humanities, which is what we're especially concerned with in Western Humanities II. We generally start our study here with the period of the Enlightenment, in which a new emphasis was put on rationality, and there was an emerging faith in the gradual perfectibility, moral, intellectual, and even physical, of man. Here you see pictured Sir Isaac Newton, who was a scientist, not a philosopher, but who was an important figure to artists and philosophers and intellectuals because he changed the way they saw the world, helping us to move forward from thinking about the universe in more magical towards more mechanical ways. Which helps us to understand, by the way, that even if the humanities stands apart, it doesn't stand alone. It's informed by and informs the other disciplines such as the maths and sciences. This picture, by the way, is by a painter and poet named William Blake, who I'll bring up again in a minute. The word Western can also be thought of as a state of mind. Here's a definition of Western culture I found on a website whose designers are concerned that Western culture is under attack. Take a moment and read the definition. Now, what's interesting about this definition is that it aligns Western culture to such notions as reason, progress, and even capitalism. And that's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. Such ideas had a particular importance for the thinkers of Western culture in the period called the Enlightenment, which is mostly associated with the 18th century, but which has continued to dominate Western thinking ever since. But the problem with this definition is not only that some non-Western cultures value reason, happiness, and even capitalism, but that Western culture itself has not always valued these things in the post-Enlightenment period. The poet William Blake, who I mentioned earlier, actually interpreted the fall of man as having occurred through an excessive devotion to reason. He named the great villain of his poems Urizen, which you might think of as your reason. The colored etching displayed here shows Urizen turning himself upside down with study, which we might understand as a commentary on the upside-down values of the Enlightenment, which men like Blake saw as privileging rational thought over inspiration and passion. And many other poets, artists, philosophers, and religious thinkers in the West, from William Wordsworth to Sigmund Freud, have pointed out the limits of rationalism. The value of reason, the reality of progress, and the promise of human perfectibility inaugurated by the Enlightenment are questions we'll come up against again and again as we study the Western humanities from the 18th century to the present. You see, somehow over the 3,000 years of Western culture we study in Western Humanities 1 and 2, we've vacillated between a classic fascination with reason and harmony and a more chaotic, sometimes dangerous, sometimes humorous fascination with disharmony and unreason. And it's all part of the tradition that we call the Western Humanities.